SANDHAN और गुजरात इंटीग्रेटेड क्लासरूम
સેટેલાઇટના માધ્યમથી જોડતી કડી એટલે સંધાન.
Good morning, my dear students. We are now in the last topic of your paper 112. Hasn't it been an interesting journey? You've looked at the characteristics of some ages. You've also looked at some writers in detail. And now it's time for acquaintances. What do we mean by acquaintances? An attempt to acquaint you, to give you some sort of a knowledge, some sort of an idea about some of the important works that were written, published, maybe staged during the period that we are talking about. Do you remember the major writers that we have discussed already in this paper? Well, let's look at some of the works and acquaintances of this paper 112. What are we looking at in acquaintances? Look at the slide and you will see that what we look at here is 4 important points. What are the 4 important points? Think of any work that you know very well. Let's think of a play by Shakespeare, for example, which you've already done in another paper. When we think of Shakespeare, you know that he wrote a number of plays. Well, let us take one play as an example. One, we have to know who the writer is. So suppose I'm thinking of Hamlet, I would say Hamlet, name of writer, William Shakespeare. Type of work naturally is tragedy. Date of publication, you would see 1606, 7, whatever it is. And the age is the Elizabethan age. So what we are going to do now, my dear students, is to look at each of the works that has been given to you in your syllabus for this part. Which part am I talking about? Acquaintances. We will look at each work and then we will see what the 4 points are that you have to remember. It would be a good idea to keep your notebooks open, to have your pen or pencil ready so that you could quickly jot down. That will make it easier for you to study later, for your exams or for your assignment. Remember, memory plays a great role in this part of the paper because you have to remember names, you have to remember dates. I shall try to make it interesting for you by telling you something more about the work so that you can connect the work with the writer with the work, and that probably will make it easier for you to remember because whatever is interesting is always easy to remember. So shall we begin the texts that have been given to us in our syllabus? The first 2-3 works that we have to look at are all by Milton. Which age did Milton belong to? He belonged to the Puritan age. What age did it come after? It came after the Elizabethan age. Why do we call it the Elizabethan age? Because it was Queen Elizabeth who ruled from the throne of England. And when I say Queen Elizabeth, should not confuse her with the Queen Elizabeth who is now ruling Great Britain. This Queen Elizabeth that we are talking about is Queen Elizabeth I. Who were the important writers of that period? You might remember William Shakespeare was an important name. Why am I telling you about the Elizabethan age? Because after that age comes the Puritan age, in which many of the writers that we are going to talk about in this paper lived and wrote. As I just told you, we call it the Puritan age. It is also called the age of Milton because Milton, John Milton, was the most important writer of this period. What did Milton write? Of course you remember the great epic that he wrote, Paradise Lost. But what we have to remember now is not Paradise Lost, but some other works that he wrote. The first one that we have, my dear students, is Comus. Comus is a mask. Please note the spelling. Please note the spelling. I'm repeating it because the word mask that you know is M-A-S-K. That is a mask, a mukoti. What you wear on your face, you could have the mask of a lion, you could have a mask of some god or goddess, or some actor or cricketer, or an animal or a bird. These are masks that you wear. But the mask that I'm talking about is a kind of literary work. It is a play. And Comus, that we are now talking about, is a masque written by John Milton. I've already told you that he lived in the Puritan age. So the 4 points that you have to remember, my dear students, you first have to remember who the writer is. The writer, John Milton. The second, the year of publication, 1637. It was presented in 1634. There is a difference in age, in years. Why? Because it was first presented on the stage in 1634. And then in 1637, it was published as a work. And that is why you've got 2 dates. But I would suggest you need to remember 1637 because the year of publication is what we are concerned with. Just for your information, I've also added the fact that it was first presented and then published. So what are the 4 points that we are going to remember, my dear students? Number 1, name of writer, John Milton. Number 2, year of publication, 1637. Number 3, type of work, masque. Number 4, Puritan age, age of Milton. You can see it on the slide. I am repeating it, so it would be a good idea to quickly jot down the details. You don't have to write sentences. You just have to jot down 4 details. How long would it take? 10 seconds for each? 40 seconds and you are done. And then remember, you go home and you learn it so that you're ready for the examination. Well, that's one work by John Milton, the first work that we have talked about in this paper. Let's go on to the second one. The second one is Lycidas. As you see at the top of the slide, I have the name of the writer for you. Both these works are by John Milton. So you have the first point, John Milton. The second point, 1637. The third point, pastoral elegy. And the fourth point, repeat again, age of Milton or the Puritan age. What is Lycidas, my dear students? It's a pastoral elegy. Do you remember? Probably in the last semester, we talked about some different kinds of poetry. And one such is the elegy. Remember, we talked about the sonnet, we talked about the ode, etc. And therefore, we probably mentioned the elegy to you in the class. What is an elegy? An elegy is a song, a poem, which is written to mourn the death of somebody or something. Generally, written to mourn the death of a person. But of course, we could write a poem, an elegy, to mourn the idea also. Maybe an idea of liberty, maybe the concept of truth. You could write of justice. You could write elegies to these two. But the elegy that I am now talking about, Lycidas, written by John Milton and published in 1637, is a pastoral elegy. I want you to understand 2 words. Elegy, I've just explained to you. And what is a pastoral? A pastoral is any kind of work, a poem in this instance, in which the main characters are shepherds and shepherdesses. This means this is an artificial kind of writing. John Milton wrote this when a good friend of his, a classmate of his, called Edward King, died by drowning when both of them were students at Cambridge. Some of these students got together. They decided to bring out a book, a memorial book, in honor of Edward King. And Milton was approached and asked to write a poem. Well, Milton did write Lycidas, one of his best-known works, probably the best after Paradise Lost and Areopagitica, which of course is a prose work. Well, Lycidas is a pastoral elegy, a poem in which the characters take on the role, the dress. It's like a fancy dress competition where you can be anything you want to. But in a pastoral work, you can only be a shepherd or a shepherdess. So, Milton and Edward King and all the other students, instead of studying at Cambridge, actually become shepherds and shepherdesses, and they sit under trees. I'm talking about the poem, my dear students. They didn't really do it, but this is an imaginative poem, a beautiful poem written by Milton, Lycidas. So what are you going to remember? You're going to remember, number one, that Lycidas was written by John Milton. Number two, the year of publication, 1637. Number three, what kind of a work is it? It is a pastoral elegy. And number four, what age was it written in? The Puritan age or the age of Milton. Can you remember all this? Of course you can. Jot it down quickly when you can still see it. So we've got two works by John Milton. But he's such an important writer of the Puritan age that we are now going to look at one more work that he wrote. What is the next work? The next work is Samson Agonistes. Again, the writer, as I just mentioned to you, John Milton. From 1637, we have moved way ahead because this work was published in 1671. What is it? It is a tragedy. The main character is Samson, who is a strong, strong man. So strong, so physically strong, that he could even pull down the pillars of palaces. That is the way Milton describes him. And this tragedy was written by John Milton. So do you have your 4 points ready, my dear students? The name of the writer, John Milton. The year of publication, 1671. The type of work, tragedy. And 4, the period, the age in which it was written, age of Milton or the Puritan age. Can you quickly try and recollect the 3 works that we have talked about? Of course you can. We have talked about Comus, which is a masque. We have talked about Lycidas, which is a pastoral elegy. And we have talked about Samson Agonistes, which is a tragedy. So you have now with you names of 3 works, all written by the same writer, John Milton, all written in the same period, the Puritan age or the age of Milton. But what we have to remember is that there are 3 different kinds of work, 3 literary forms. I'm sure you know the word genre, maybe a little difficult in pronunciation, but you spell it as G-E-N-R-E, pronounced genre, because it's a French word, and somehow in the English language we have retained the word. Doesn't matter if you can't say genre, you can still call it a literary form. Or remember the spelling G-E-N-R-E and say it silently to yourself the way you would be able to remember it. Of course, a literary form would do just as well. So, 3 works, 1 writer, 1 age, 2 different dates, 1637 and 1671. And of course, 3 different genres, 1 a masque, 1 a pastoral elegy, and 1 a tragedy. I'm repeating it again and again, my dear students, because I want to ensure that you've got your notes right, that you've jotted it down so that you can look at it again and try to remember it so that it goes into your memory, a memory chip maybe that you have in your brain, so that you can recall it as and when required. Can we now go on to the fourth text that we have, the 4th work that we have? I'm going into a different kind of poetry now. Let me just mention first the details that you have to remember. The name of the work is The Temple. It is by George Herbert. It was published in 1633. It is an example. It is a work of metaphysical poetry. And once again, it is the Puritan age or the age of Milton. What is metaphysical poetry? In the same paper, or even in your first semester, When we were talking about ages and their characteristics, when we were talking about writers and the ages, when we were talking about works and the writers, I'm sure you came across the word metaphysical poetry, metaphysical poet, metaphysical age. Who is the most important poet that you remember, my dear students? Of course, you remember John Donne. You probably remember Death Be Not Proud. Maybe you remember his sonnets. Maybe you remember his love poems. Maybe you remember his divine poems. But I'm going to talk about George Herbert, who was a contemporary of John Donne. What is the work that we are now talking about? We are talking about The Temple, a collection of poems by George Herbert, published in 1633. What is it? Metaphysical poetry. And what is the age? The Puritan age, or the age of Milton. Remember, we call them the metaphysical poets because their conceits or their examples, their similes, their metaphors were so far-fetched that Dr. Johnson called them the metaphysical poets. To show learning was their whole endeavor, is what another critic said of them. So can we now jot down, my dear students? The Temple, name of the writer, George Herbert. Year of publication, 1633. Kind of work, metaphysical poetry. The period to which it belongs, the Puritan age or the age of Milton. Have you got that down? Metaphysical poetry. Metaphysical. Get your spellings right too. Because remember, we're going to give you marks. So many marks just to be had. So you can't misspell these words. So do remember, metaphysical poetry. And the age, of course, is the same age in which we still are. What is that age? The age of Milton, or the Puritan age. So that finishes 4 of the texts that are prescribed to us. Can we go on to the 5th text? It is the Mistress. And you have Abraham Cowley. Abraham Cowley. 1647. Collection of love poems. The Puritan age, the age of Milton. I just mentioned to you that John Donne wrote poems, love poems, as well as divine poems. Well, most of the writers of this period did write both kinds of poetry. On one, there was love for the human, for the fellow human. Love of man for woman. At the same time, there was also a great deal of writing about the love for God, the love of God, for which I used earlier the term divine poems. Poems about man's love for God. Well, the Mistress, as the word itself suggests, as the title itself suggests, is a collection of love poems. Unlike the previous one, the Temple, which, as you can make out, did have religion, did have theology. The Mistress is a collection of love poems by Abraham Cowley, published 1647. So get the name right first. The name of the writer, Abraham Cowley. Spell that out if you want once, loudly maybe in the classroom, so that you remember it. Abraham Cowley. What is it? It's a collection of love poems. When was it published? 1647. And what is the age that we are talking about? The Puritan age or the age of Milton. A collection of love poems by Abraham Cowley, published in 1647. We are in one age. All the writers, all the works that we have so far been talking about belong to the same age. But as we progress with our texts, with the works that have been given to us for acquaintances, you will notice that we move on to another age. I already mentioned to you that the Puritan age came after the Elizabethan age. And what comes after the Puritan age? A quick question to yourself. Do you remember Well, very soon we will come to that age too. But at the moment, we are still in the Puritan age, the age of Milton, the towering personality, the poet who wrote the first epic in the English language, Paradise Lost, and then wrote a sequel to it as Paradise Regained. Let's move on to the next text, the next work, literary work that we have to look at. Remember, I just told you that we are still in the Puritan age, but very soon we will move on to another age. And you might notice now, of course you can see, that the next age that we are talking about is the Restoration Age. You might ask, what is the Restoration Age? What does the word mean? The Puritans, remember, were very strict. They shut down all the theatres. Shakespeare's plays were written, published and staged in the Elizabethan age. But soon after that, you had the Puritan age, who believed in no entertainment, and therefore all the theatres were shut. And after the Puritan age comes the Restoration Age. Of course, you know the word restore. You know the word restore, to bring back. So what do we mean when we say the Restoration Age? What or who was restored? The King of England was restored to the throne of England in 1660. So from 1660 begins what is called the Restoration Age, also called sometimes the Age of Dryden, because as I just mentioned to you, Milton was the most important writer of the Puritan age. So too was Dryden the most important writer of the Restoration Age. Of course, there are many writers, and we're going to talk about them. We are beginning with a work called The Rehearsal Transposed. What is it? It is a prose writing. We looked at poetry, we looked at drama, remember, we looked at tragedy, we looked at masque, we looked at poetry, and now we move on to prose writing. I want to draw your attention, my dear students, to the fact that poetry was much more common in the Elizabethan age, in the Puritan age, but gradually, in fact, it began in the Elizabethan age, but gradually we moved towards more and more prose writing, of which you will see a great deal when we come to the neoclassical age. But that's not a part of this paper. So, we are talking about The Rehearsal Transposed by Andrew Marvell. It's a collection of prose writing. A lot of it deals with a lot of controversial topics. What are controversial topics, my dear students? Where different people hold very different opinions on a subject. That means not everybody agrees. Now, these controversial topics that he dealt with were mainly related to the political parties of the time. He called it the Rehearsal Transposed, but actually it was a collection of prose writing by Andrew Marvell, published in 1672-73. That means it spilt over more than 1 year, 72 and 73, 1672 and 1673, a collection of prose writings. What is interesting is, though they deal with controversial topics, there is a lot of humor that one comes across in this writing. Andrew Marvell was very good at humor in his prose writing. And in some sense, there seems to be a vindication of Milton. What is meant by a vindication? A lot of people criticized Milton. Milton belonged to an age which was very, very different from the Restoration Age. Do you remember a little bit of your history of English literature? You would remember then that it is in the Restoration period that a lot of English courtiers came back from France. So from France they brought French culture, which was very different from the traditional culture of England. and therefore a Puritan like Milton was criticized. But Andrew Marvell did not agree with this criticism, and therefore there was a kind of vindication. That means arguing in favor of Milton. Do you understand that, my dear students? People of the Restoration age criticized Milton, who belonged to the Puritan age, the previous age. But somebody like Andrew Marvell, who actually belonged to the Restoration age, considered Milton to be a great writer. And therefore, in this work, one of the very controversial topics that he does discuss is Milton. And what does he do in this work? There is a vindication of Milton. That means he is writing in favor of Milton. He is writing against the criticism that was leveled towards Milton, against Milton in the Restoration period. Remember, each age in literature is different from the previous age. I've already told you how the Puritan age was different from the Elizabethan age. I've also mentioned to you how the Restoration age was different from the Puritan age. Each age has a lot of characteristics, a lot of ideas, a lot of viewpoints, a lot of concepts which are very different from those which were accepted in the previous age. So what is the text that we have just looked at, my dear students? The rehearsal transposed. Who is the writer? Andrew Marvell. When was it written, published? 1672-73. What is it? It is a prose writing. Which age does it belong to? The Restoration age. Have you jotted that and made note of the fact that now we are moving on from the Puritan age into the next age, which is the Restoration age? And why was it called the Restoration age? I've already explained to you. I'm sure you will remember that when you look at these texts. Can we go on now to the next text, my dear students? It is Noble Numbers. Noble Numbers. Poets choose their titles for various reasons. One sometimes cannot understand why, but maybe when we read the text, some idea does come to us as to why the poet gave such a name to his work. The work is called Noble Numbers. Who is the writer? The writer is Robert Herrick. When was the work published? 1647. What is it? It is a collection of short poems. We are going back in age, but naturally we need to, because you already know that the Restoration age in England began only in 1660. So anything that was written prior to 1660 in this paper has to belong to the Puritan age. Simple. Obvious. Is that not what you are saying to yourself, my dear students? And how correct you are, because Robert Herrick's Noble Numbers was published in 1647, well before the Restoration age began. What is it? It is a collection of short poems. What age are we talking about? We are talking about the Puritan age, or the age of Milton. Robert Herrick was called a Cavalier poet. A Cavalier is a soldier, is a brave soldier. So what are these poems about? What are the main themes of these poems? War and love. Love and war. Very often they are two sides of the same coin. So you have now Noble Numbers by Robert Herrick, 1647, collection of short poems, the Puritan age, or the age of Milton. Are you asking yourself, my dear students, where do I get all this information from? Where do I, as a student, remember the text that is prescribed for you? History of English Literature by Albert. You just have to look at that book, my dear students, and you will get all this information. You must go to the age that we are talking about. Look at the writers, and if you want some additional information, you would get that. Another book that you could look at is what is called a Cambridge Guide or an Oxford Guide to English Literature. These are voluminous books. They might frighten you. Well, they are the size of a dictionary. And why not? You are not expected to read the whole book, my dear students, but as they are arranged in alphabetical order, as the entire book is in alphabetical order, all that you have to do is to go to H, Herrick, because remember, we will take the surname first, the Attak first, and therefore we will have to go to H, look at Herrick, Robert, start reading. What is there about him? Maybe a paragraph. There you will come across the work Noble Numbers. You will know what it is, when it was published. And the moment you know when it was published, you will obviously know what age it belongs to. So what are the books that you have to look at, my dear students? As we are moving further on in the same topic, I just want to remind you that you can look at your prescribed History of English Literature by Albert, or you can look at a Cambridge Guide to English Literature or an Oxford Guide to English Literature. You will get all the information that I'm giving you. In case you have missed any of this information, it would be a good idea to go back. But you really don't have to miss it, because I'm saying it so slowly. I'm repeating it so many times that you just cannot miss it. Do you have a problem with spelling? Well, look at the slide and quickly jot it down. Do you want to know how to pronounce it? Listen to the way I'm saying it and try and say it after me so that you will get the pronunciation also correct. But anyway, this is not an oral examination, so you must pay more attention to the spelling. You must pay more attention to the details. So what are the details that you're looking at? Noble Numbers by Robert Herrick. The date, 1647. The type of work, collection of short poems. The age, Puritan age or age of Milton. Can we go on to the next text? The history of the rebellion and civil wars in England. My God, what a big, big name. We are moving into another genre, another literary form, written by Edward Hyde Clarendon. He's talking about the Civil War in England. As we do not have time, I cannot go into the history of England in this paper or in this lecture, but those of you who are interested could surely see what was happening between the king and parliament at that time in England. So he's talking about the rebellion and the civil war in England. Interestingly, Edward Hyde Clarendon is writing. What he is writing is based on his own experience. What do I mean by that? He lived in that period. As he lived in that period, he experienced the history of his country. And what was happening in his country? There was rebellion and there was civil war. So this is not an autobiography, but it is the history of a period in which he lived. It's a long work. And maybe many of us will not be able to read it. But that doesn't mean we should not have some idea about what the work is about. You might wonder, why are we talking about a history book in a literature paper? After all, the title of my paper is History of English Literature. You are probably asking yourself, or you would like to ask me, well, why do we talk about history? Because the book is so beautifully written. The language that Edward Hyde Clarendon uses is so much like that of a great novelist, and therefore we use this also as a part of literature. I'm repeating that. It is a book of history, certainly. It is in some ways a biography, because Clarendon talks about the people who lived at that time, their contribution to the history of England, those who contributed to the rebellion and the civil wars. You could read this book also as a biography. But again, why are we studying it in literature? Let me say that again. Why are we studying it? Of course, you know the answer. Because it is as great as any book of literature. It is a book of history. It is a book of biography about the rebellion and civil wars. A war, a battle, yuddha, is usually fought between two countries. But when, for various reasons, war takes place within the country, that is between the citizens of the same country, then we call it a civil war. A civil war is a terrible thing, but in different ages, in different parts of the world, civil wars have been fought. You might remember the civil war that was fought in the US for the abolition of slavery. So also you had the civil wars in England towards the end of the 17th century. So we have the history of the rebellion and civil wars in England, written by Edward Hyde Clarendon, the years 1702 to 1704, 1702 to 1704. What is it? A work, a history, biography, and which period? Of course you know, it's after 1660 and therefore it is the Restoration Age. Have you jotted that down? Can we now go on to the next work? The next work is Preston Warbeck. The name of the work is Preston Warbeck. What is it? Who is the writer? The writer is John Ford. A much easier name than the previous name, right? Hyde, Clarendon. I'm sure it was difficult for you to remember that name. This is an easy name, John Ford. The year 1634. The type of work, historical play. And the period. Of course, you are telling me. You don't have to tell us the period. We know the period. Of course, it is the Puritan age or the age of Milton. Because we've already looked at other texts which were written in 1637. And you know that was the Puritan age. What is it? It's a historical play. There are lots of plays written by Shakespeare that we call historical plays. What do we mean by that? We mean that the character who is probably the hero or the protagonist, Richard II for example, was actually a king who ruled. He is a historical figure. That means he really existed. And what does the writer do? What does Ford do in Preston Warbeck? He has taken a character who has really lived and written a play about him. It is a tragedy. I've called it a historical play, but just for your information, it is a tragedy. And quite a horrible tragedy. That is the kind of violence that you see in this play makes us think of the revenge tragedies that were written in the Elizabethan age. This historical tragedy, according to some critics, is probably the best historical play after the historical plays of Shakespeare. This is the opinion of one critic. You could agree or not agree, because now not many people really read Preston Warbeck. But it's important for us to remember, as students of English literature, it is important for us to remember that one of the important plays written in the Puritan age was a play called Preston Warbeck, written by John Ford, published in 1634. Important to remember because we are looking at the history of English literature in this paper, and we are getting acquainted with some of the important works that were published during this period. So have you jotted that down? I'm repeating it again for you. Preston Warbeck, written by John Ford, a historical play, The Age of Milton or the Puritan Age. Can we go on to the next one? Yes, we can. We are coming once again to prose work. a very, very important work of this period. Remember, we are looking at poetry, we are looking at drama, and we are also looking at prose. In the Puritan age, there was a lot of prose written. Even before the Puritan age, Francis Bacon had already written his essays. And now you have somebody called Sir Thomas Browne. Religio Medici, a Latin word, so Religio Medici. Written by Sir Thomas Browne, the years 1642 to 1643. It's a prose work. The main topic is religion, and 42-43 before 1660, and therefore once again the Puritan age or the age of Milton. I have taken the texts as they come in the syllabus so as not to confuse you, and therefore there is a little bit of going forwards and backwards. But don't worry about that, because the moment you see the year, you know which age it belongs to. So we are looking at Sir Thomas Browne, 1642-43, a prose work on religion, Puritan age. Works of religion, there is another word that we still use, and which was certainly used in the Puritan age, and that is theology. Theo, T-H-E-O, theology. So that would be a good word for you to remember. When we talk about religious texts, writings on religion, we do use the word theology. Let's go on to the next text. A new way to pay old debts. Interesting, isn't it? Doesn't the term itself, the name itself, the title itself suggest that it has to be a comedy? A new way to pay old debts. The writer, Philip Messenger. Written 1633. But enacted in 1625-26. Remember, right at the beginning I told you, sometimes plays are first staged and then published. Of course, plays could be published first and then staged, as many of them are done today in the 21st century. But in those days, they were first enacted, first staged, and then published. So a new way to pay old debts by Philip Messenger was enacted in 25-26, but published in 1633. It's a comedy, a good comedy, a good plot construction, I believe it has. But the characters are types, they are not individuals. So there is somebody who would represent greed, somebody who would represent lust, somebody who would represent hunger. So they become types and not. If you remember a little bit of your history of drama, of the pre-Elizabethan age, you must have heard of morality plays and mystery plays. And then you might have come across the word types. So let's look at a new way to pay old debts. The writer, Philip Messenger, 1633, enacted in 1625, a comedy, the Puritan age. Then we move on to the Leviathan, another text by Thomas Hobbes. Those of you who are a little interested in political science or have political science must have heard of Hobbes, Locke and Rousseau. Maybe somewhere in your civics in school, maybe, or maybe in social science, or maybe in political science you have heard of him. The Leviathan. At the bottom of the slide, just see the full title. Leviathan, or the matter, form and power of a commonwealth, ecclesiastical and civil. Oh my God, what a long name. Thank God, we are going to remember it just as Leviathan. Who is the writer? Thomas Hobbes. What is it? It is a political treatise. A treatise, my dear students, is a long essay. You might have heard the word thesis, which we use for research work. For your PhD or an MPhil, you have to submit a thesis. Well, a treatise is something like that. It is a long, learned essay. It was written, published in 1651. Interesting. The Latin text was later in 1668. Remember, Latin is one of the ancient languages of Europe. something like Sanskrit for India. And a lot of people in those days believed that if you want your work to be remembered, it should be written in Latin. Even Francis Bacon did that and wrote his Novum Organum in Latin. Anyway, so you have a treatise on political philosophy. The age again, my dear students, 1651. So we are still in the Puritan age. Let's look at the next text, Holy Living by Jeremy Taylor. Holy Living by Jeremy Taylor. Prose again. This is theology. Again, remember, I told you the word. It's prose, of course, but it is religious prose. And therefore, the rule and exercise of holy living is the title, the full title of the play, of the work. It is a prose work. Jeremy Taylor. The next one is The Lady of Pleasure by James Shirley. 1635, a comedy, The Puritan Age or the Age of Milton. The Complete Angler is something I'd like to talk about for a minute. It's by Isaac Walton, written in 1653. It's a prose work. But what is interesting is, can you imagine what the topic is, my dear students? The topic of this prose work is fishing. How to go fishing, what you should do to fish, what are the best ways to fish. The entire thing is in a form of dialogue, 5 days of picnicking maybe, and they talk about fishing. This again is the Puritan age or the age of Milton. A quick look at the 3 ages that we have talked about in this lecture. Can you quickly jot it down? 1550 to 1630, Elizabethan age or the age of Shakespeare. 1630 to 1660, the Puritan age or the age of Milton. 1660 to 1700, Restoration age or the age of Dryden. 1700 can extend a little more into 1705 or 1710, because remember, literary ages do not exactly end at a moment in time. So we have looked at 3 ages, we have looked at 15 texts. I've tried to describe the text to you so that you take back home with you from this lecture some idea of what the work is about. And that would help you remember the text much better when you have to write those 4 points. But remember the 4 points: the name of the author, the year in which it was published, the kind of work, and the age in which it was written. I hope you've enjoyed this lecture, my dear students. This is the last lecture for you in this paper. Thank you very much.
SANDHAN All Gujarat Integrated Classroom.
સેટેલાઇટના માધ્યમથી જોડતી કડી એટલે સંધાન.